This is Nina Serrano for La Raza Chronicles. My guest today is librarian archivist at the South San Francisco Public Library, writer, and former executive director of Acción Latina, Eva Martinez. I've invited Eva today because we are celebrating the publication of our new anthology, a project we've been working on for the last 7 years. Eva, bienvenido. Tell everyone about this.
Thank you, Nina. It's a joy to be here with you. The anthology is called Poetry in Flight, Poesía en Vuelos, Anthology in Celebration of El Tecolote. And I think I have to go back to the beginning of how this project even came to be. And that was in 2010 when I was the executive director of Acción Latina. We were celebrating the 35th year of El Tecolote newspaper, and for those of you that don't know, it's the longest running bilingual newspaper in the Southwest. And we had planned a series of events that year. One was a beautiful edition of El Tecolote that was filled with poetry, and the cover featured art by Juan R. Fuentes, local artist, and also someone who had been on the staff of Tecolote in the early days. And we did that special edition because it was to honor the literary history of El Tecolote. In the 80s, it had a quarterly literary supplement that was edited by, among other people, Francisco X. Alarcón. And that was very important space because at that time there was no internet, or there was, but there wasn't public access to it. So that supplement provided important publishing space for Latino writers, which was far and wide in between, right? So we published that special newspaper as a result of a committee coming together under Francisco X. Alarcón's direction. And that included yourself, Nina, me, Francisco, Alfonso Texidor, and Estela de la Cruz. And so we made a call, we got a ton of poetry submissions. And the Tecolote staff designed this beautiful newspaper with art in it too. And that was in July of 2010. After that, we decided we were going to produce a book, a hard copy book featuring poetry. But then our first obstacle happened, and that was I left Acción Latina to work on my own, and the committee dissolved, basically, but with a promise that we would get back together. We were all committed to this project of doing the book. Okay, so that was in 2010.
A lot of things were happening in everyone's lives. People were getting and losing jobs, starting and ending relationships. A lot was happening, and we thought it would just be a short respite before we'd come together and publish the anthology.
Right, and 1 year turned into 2 years turned into 4, and then we had a tragedy happen.
You're referring to the passing of Alfonso Texidor.
Yes, Alfonso. And most people know that he was connected to El Tecolote. Well, he was our calendario editor, and he did that with amazing skill and grace and made sure that it was a wide variety of things listed in the calendario. I mean, he was such an integral part of Tecolote, so to see him become more ill and pass on Christmas Day was devastating to all the Tecolote people, but also to our committee.
And it was the shock that galvanized us to reform and vow once again that we were going to publish this book.
Yes. And thank goodness that we had the amazing skill and guidance of Francisco, because I think without him, I remember, in fact, when we first made the call for the newspaper and all these poems came in, and I was there at the office collecting them. And I don't know if you remember the table with hundreds and hundreds of poems on it, and I was just overwhelmed. I didn't even know where to start, but Francisco came in and said, well, this is how we're going to do it.
He was amazing. We were overwhelmed by stacks and stacks of paper that must have been 6 or 8 feet long table that was pretty high with poetry. He said, we're going to decide on the themes and put them in piles by themes. And we decided on the themes. I don't remember what they were, because in poetry, they're really, no matter what kind of poetry, there are just a very limited number of themes: love, family, death, nature,
right,
politics, etc.
Right.
That gave us a way to begin getting them into those piles. Then there were the yes, no, maybe piles, and that took meeting after meeting to go through yes, no, and maybe.
And that was for the newspaper edition. So after Alfonsito passed, in early 2015, we knew we had to come back together. The committee had to meet again. So we did, and your home was often the place of our meetings.
Yes, and my husband would cook us wonderful dinners.
Thank goodness for him. That's when we recruited Harold Terrazon to join the committee. So it was the four of us, Francisco, you, myself, and Harold. And there again, we made another call. We got over 200, because I tracked the poetry and made the Excel chart. We got over 200 submissions. And once again, Francisco put his magic and led us through that. But even then, it took a long time, because we carefully evaluated every single poem. This was not a fast process by any means.
No. Each poem really got at least 3 read-aloud reviews.
Right. And so that was 2015, and as we neared the end of the year, we had selected the poems, we had ranked them, we were about ready to notify the poets. Then Francisco informs us that he is ill.
And within 2 weeks...
Within 2 weeks...
he dies.
Yes.
We were stunned, paralyzed, shocked. The whole community was really.
Maybe you could say that last time he read at that gathering at La Boheme for him.
Well, it was within those 2 weeks. It was within 2 days of his actual death, I think, that a poetry reading was organized at La Boheme coffee shop in the heart of the mission. And all the poets came. There were, to say standing room only was an understatement. You really could barely stand. It was so crowded. And each person got up and read their poem for him. But more special was that he, who could not stand up at this point, but from his seated position, read his poems to us, facing a screen, and on the screen were projected the words of his poems so that he could read it. And the poem was called Viva la Vida, because that was Francisco, who loved life right to the end. And he was surrounded by his family members who assisted him, because he would get tired. And as he informed the audience, he was going to have to leave before the event was over, and there were more poems to be read to him. But he had to leave because he had a blood-changing or blood-thinning need that he had to go back. And he left. And there was the awareness in the room that perhaps we had just seen him for the very last time. And his contributions to poetry and to Latino poetry in the United States was something so huge and so powerful.
Right. You know, I was heartsick because I didn't make that event, because I had a personal thing happen the night before, and I hadn't gotten hardly any sleep. And I couldn't even talk about it for a week. But then I thought about the meetings at your house and how he would come in, usually with a bottle of wine, or I'd arrive and he'd be at the table smiling. And, you know, I'm happy that that's my last vision of him.
Yes. And to get to those meetings, he had to drive from Davis, California to Oakland.
Right.
Which he did.
Yeah.
Which he did, because he was devoted to poetry and poetry of the people. We, on this call around, on this version of the anthology process, we got some pretty high-level poems in that many of the people who submitted were teachers of creative writing, and their poetry was very, very developed. But Francisco insisted that in the criteria, we leave room for the true voice of the community, the untutored poet, the poet writing from the heart, which we did.
Mm-hmm. We did.
So his contribution as the people's poet was tremendous. And for me, the thrill at those meetings was that I got to read to Francisco the poem that I wrote for him. And that poem grew out of his telling us that he was waiting for this phone call from the governor, because there was the possibility he was going to be the poet laureate of California. But at that last meeting at La Boheme, he announced that he did get the call from the governor's office saying that he would not be the poet laureate of California, but instead a Republican had been picked. For me, it was very shocking. The idea of a Republican poet, though, seemed like oxymoron. I'd never met a Republican poet. But that didn't really hinder Francisco. He told that as a joke. Mm-hmm. He told that as a joke because he knew that his poetry would live on with or without titles.
Right. He's the people's poet laureate.
Yes.
Forever he will be that.
Yes. So how did we go from the death of Francisco, which was totally paralyzing, to the announcement that on March 19th, we are having our release party for Poetry in Flight, Poesía en Vuelos at Acción Latina?
Well, that's the last leg of our journey, right? So then it was you and Harold and myself. You know, it's kind of a blur to me. It's funny, this last period is kind of a blur to me, but we just said we really have to do this now. We have to contact all the poets, have them have a good look at their poetry to make sure everything's correct. We got the releases. I mean, it was a ton of work that we've actually accomplished in this last leg.
We're able to get Juan Fuentes to commission him to do this beautiful cover. We were able to get Adrian Arias to design the book for us and to color the cover, because the original cover by Juan Fuentes was in black and white.
Right.
But Adrian colored the cover.
Gorgeously.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Yes. I would laugh, not laugh, I would actually feel bad because I kept having to send emails out to the poet saying, well, we're not quite ready yet. I know I announced that we would be, and I think I did that about 4 or 5 times. But, you know, these poets have been so understanding and so supportive. I get emails back like, yes, we know we've lost our mentor, Francisco, we understand. And, you know, I got a lot of love from them. 56 poets and 69 poems.
So it's a lot of poets and a lot of poetry. And we wanted a really worthy introduction to this. And so we were able to enlist the support of Juan Felipe Herrera, the poet laureate of the United States, who wrote the most beautiful introduction. And I'll read you some excerpts because he actually tells the story of the literary history of the Latino movement. This is from Juan Felipe Herrera, Poet Laureate of the United States. Deco poetas from La Misión will and shall continue, by Juan Felipe Herrera. All I have is deep love for this El Tecolote anthology. It has been a long, brave, flowering, organizing road of dedicated, rough-cut, change-maker poets, artists, and writers without a home once upon a time, until they found their sole roots in the offices of El Tecolote newspaper, bilingual and revolutionary, in the Frida Kahlo flame-rising heart of La Misión. That's right. Many writers traveled this road many decades ago. Way before Latino writers in the mission in 1887, we had the Mexican writer Miguel Prieto, who wrote Viajes a los Estados Unidos. Downtown San Francisco, after visiting Chinatown and jotting the price of the dishes, he stepped into a bar, frowned and grimaced, jumped back when he noticed a Mexicano with his chip boots on the table, his swarthy, pockmarked face, prickly mustache, whiskey in hand, and tilted chicharron-shaped sombrero. "Ayancado," he said, an Americanized brown. He was becoming aware that things were changing, that we were all changing. But was he right? Ayancado? Guess who was the monster thinker, volcanic editor, boundless energy dynamo that pulled us poets and artists into the El Teco revolution? In addition to Juan Gonzalez and the groovy staff. Yes, correct, Francisco X. Alarcón. Pancho had the bad habit of being an effervescent, magnetic innovator. We had just come back from Mexico City, where he explored with the nerviest idea that in that boiling cauldron of artists and editors, to put together the first U.S. Latino poetry, art, and essay insert, El Suplemento Literario, for the mega periodical, Mexico's Excelsior newspaper, with work from writers in La Misión, a West Coast emphasis and national antennae. Pancho followed up. "Let's do a suplemento for El Teco. What do you think?" That's all we needed to hear, and boom, bam, buzz, El Teco Literario emerged from the Paisley, the Juan Tepecan bowels of the Ayancado and Ayancada. Many artists, poets from La Misión published, and many from Latin America. Francisco, our dear literary leader, passed away last year. Now we are here with this magnificent anthology, a tribute to him and a culmination of many generations, a long line of cantos, songs, experiments, and poems. Carry this book with your life. It is made of many lives. Those were excerpts from Juan Felipe Herrera in his foreword to our new anthology, Poesía in Vuelos, Poetry in Flight. Eva, how can people get a copy of the book?
Well, it's going to be released on March 19th, and we're having a launch party, as you mentioned earlier. It's going to be at the offices of Acción Latina El Tecolote at 2958 24th Street on Sunday, March 19th from 2 to 5. You can buy a copy there. You can also email Vuelos Poesía at gmail.com. So if you want to pre-order the book, you can email Vuelos Poesía at gmail.com. That's VUELOPOESIA at gmail.com. Orders of 10 or more will receive a 10% discount.
And the reason we're offering books in that discounted number, 10 at a time, is because we think this is a book that belongs in the classroom, that educators should find ways to incorporate it into their curriculum because it has some of the best Latino writing out there. And at this particular time, the Latino voice, when it's being so defamed by the president of the country, is a very powerful and important voice that should be heard.
Yes, and the themes are diverse. There's themes on equality, inclusion, freedom, social justice, gender identity, gentrification, and more. So these writers, you could tell that they're just writing from their heart and addressing a number of issues, even though I would say probably all of these poems were written before the catastrophe that we have now in the White House.
But for the Latino community, there has been a buildup of anti-Latino rhetoric in the country and deportations. So that's one of the reasons. And also the great gentrification moves that were happening and still are in San Francisco and all over the country that inspired so many of these poems. So we hope to see you there on March 19th at Acción Latina at our book party.
Yes, please come. And if you buy a book, many of the poets will be there reading, so you could get it signed by them. We'll also have some activities. Children are welcome. Please come.
Well, thank you so much, Eva Martinez.
Thank you, Nina.